Okay, so let's try and unpack this a bit. You know how sometimes you're just drowning in articles, all this research, news feeds,
Mm.
and you're trying to figure out what actually matters? Well, that's kind of what we're trying to do here today. We're taking a deep dive into two, well, really intertwined topics and often, intensely debated ones: global cultural influence and the evolving world of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, as most people know it. Our sources for this, they're really fascinating, actually. We've pulled from like candid Reddit discussions from Nepal about cultural hegemony, all the way to academic research on corporate governance and a whole stack of recent reports, news articles covering the benefits, the backlash, the global takes on DEI. It's a lot. So our mission really is to sift through all this stuff, pull out those, surprising facts as crucial nuggets of knowledge, and help you understand how these global narratives get shaped and what DEI truly means. Its
Hmm.
practical side, the challenges, maybe where it's headed next. Let's start with something that, well, really caught my eye. It's a pretty striking observation from a Reddit discussion on Arnapol, a user that was sort of grappling with how globalization and or capitalism seems to have, well, lifted certain nations to ruling status.
Uh-huh.
And they question how the worldview from these places through media, social media, education has essentially taken over political discourse in the English-speaking populace across the world.
Yeah.
So what's really going on there?
Yeah, that's a really powerful observation. It points directly to this thing academics often call cultural hegemony. It's basically this idea that the dominant culture's values, their beliefs, they sort of subtly become the norm,
Hmm.
right? And others can unconsciously adopt them. The Reddit user put it so well, didn't they? Highlighting how Nepali people might end up promoting political opinions from certain groups in the Anglospheric world,
Yeah.
even if those ideas, well, they lack practical implications on our non-English speaking populace.
Right, so it's not just about the language itself, but the actual ideas sort
Mm.
of embedded within it.
Exactly. That's the core of it. The sources give some really vivid examples. Like, think about political discussions in India. When they happen in English, they're almost always framed as left versus right.
Hmm.
But if you look at contemporary regional language media, those terms, they aren't commonly used or even understood in quite the same way. Or take the popularization of socialism in Anglospheric countries. That's influenced debates globally, right?
Yeah.
Even in places where maybe terms like capitalism is bad and socialism is progress, we're already kind of entrenched, but
Yeah.
maybe with different local meanings, different nuances.
That's a subtle point, but yeah, really profound. And the media's role in this, it seems huge based on the examples, like the one about France.
Absolutely. Anglospheric media, when covering certain events there, often focused on, quote, further stigmatizing of Muslims.
Hmm.
But the French media, discussing the same events, were zeroing in on the killing and defending of its universal Republican model.
Wow. Same event, totally different narrative focus.
Exactly. It just shows how the lens we use is so heavily influenced by these dominant narratives.
And this is where it got really striking for me. The sources even pointed to Mount Everest, calling it the epitome of English hegemony.
Mm.
I mean, a landmark with these long-standing local names, but now overwhelmingly known by its English one, that really makes you pause, doesn't it?
It really does, puts it right into perspective. And the Reddit post itself, it provocatively asks, will this cultural hegemony still continue? Especially with the rise of China and India and the potential decline of the U.S. soft power.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, how deep are these cultural influences? And what's their future, really, as global power dynamics shift?
That sets the stage perfectly, actually, because this idea of evolving cultural influence,
Good.
it brings us right to another major global discussion: diversity, equity, and inclusion. Most of us know it as DEI, but it's definitely more than just a buzzword.
Oh, absolutely. It truly is. Our sources explain DEI primarily as an organizational framework, originating, yes, in the United States, and it's designed to, quote, promote the fair treatment and full participation of all people.
Hmm.
With a particular focus, of course, on groups who've historically been underrepresented or face discrimination based on identity or disability.
And it's interesting, isn't it, how many different acronyms there are for this? I mean, I've heard DEI, DEIB, JEDI. It can get a little confusing.
You're right, the names do vary. The core concepts are similar, though. We see DEI, DEIB that adds belonging, JEDI, which is justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, IDEA, adding accessibility. And over in the UK, it's often EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion.
Okay.
But essentially, they all represent these three closely linked values.
And within those values, there's that distinction that often comes up between equity and equality. Can you break that down? Because I think that's where some common misunderstandings can start.
Yeah, it's a really crucial point. So if equality implies treating everyone as if their experiences are exactly the same,
Right, like same treatment for all.
exactly,
Yeah.
then equity is different.
Yeah.
Equity recognizes that people have varying experiences and backgrounds, so it aims for fair treatment that's sort of tailored to those differences. It's sometimes framed as moving from just equality of opportunity towards equality of outcome.
Okay, so maybe like equality is everyone gets the same ladder, but equity is making sure everyone can actually reach the apples on the tree.
That's a great analogy, yeah. If equality gives everyone the same size shoe, equity makes sure everyone gets a shoe that actually fits them.
Got it. And it's compelling that these underlying ideas, they aren't entirely brand new, are they? The sources point to some early efforts in the US, like preferential hiring for Civil War veterans, even their widows.
Right, codified way back in acts, like the Veterans Preference Act of 1944.
So the philosophy has deeper roots than maybe we realize. Okay, so given all that background, why are so many companies, organizations globally focusing so much on DEI now? It's clearly not just about ticking a compliance box.
Absolutely not, no. The sources consistently show that when DEI is pursued systematically, really integrated,
Yeah.
it becomes core to their mission and embedded into strategic goals. And there's a strong link often cited between having diverse perspectives and achieving inclusive growth performance. It's seen as building a better, more effective organization.
And the research backs that up with some pretty tangible benefits, right? Not just ideals.
It does, yeah. There's quite a bit of research. For instance, gender diversity on corporate boards,
Mm.
that's linked to things like improved boardroom behavior, um, a greater diversity of opinion in decision-making.
Okay.
And what's particularly interesting is the finding that women directors have been shown to contribute to higher wage moderation and restraint in the use of long-term variable remuneration systems.
Wait, so more women on boards might actually lead to more sensible executive pay. Less of those huge, potentially destabilizing packages.
That's what the research suggests. It points towards maybe a more balanced approach to compensation, perhaps a broader focus on long-term stakeholder value, not just short-term executive gain.
That is a powerful business case right there. Not just optics, but potentially smarter, more stable financial decisions.
Exactly. And beyond the boardroom, having a cognitively diverse workforce, people who think differently, will enable businesses to tackle challenges effectively. And on a more sort of day-to-day level, flexible working policies,
Yeah. Remote work, part-time.
right? Things like remote work, part-time hours, job shares, those have been shown to actually increase staff productivity and reduce absenteeism.
So, okay, lots of clear benefits. The big question then is, how can organizations make DEI truly effective, not just, a program of the month?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? McKinsey's research offers some key insights here. They suggest starting with a purpose-led approach, really embedding the DEI strategy across the company. But importantly, allowing for local tailoring. What works in one region might need tweaking elsewhere.
Makes sense.
And crucially, they emphasize prioritizing belonging and inclusive practices. It's not just about getting diverse talent in the door.
But keeping them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Retention is key. And you need to embolden and activate champions and allies by actually recognizing their efforts. But what really stood out to me was the need to act on feedback, including dissenting voices.
Even the criticism.
Especially the criticism, perhaps. That's how you identify roadblocks, blind spots, and really optimize the impact. Things like surveys can pinpoint which groups feel unheard or blocked, or where psychological safety is weakest. You need that honest feedback.
Okay, so clear benefits, best practices. Yet, despite all that, DEI initiatives are facing some significant headwinds, aren't they? A lot of reevaluation, especially here in the United States. It feels like a really complex moment.
It really is. Yeah, headwinds is a good word for it. One perspective we saw cited in the sources describes this phenomenon some call toxic wokery.
Okay.
Now, this viewpoint suggests that while initial woke activism, quote, shone a light on real injustices, it later became somehow captured and blurred, particularly on social media, leading to what these critics describe as performative outrage, and even attempts to, quote, impose greater injustice to address perceived wrongs.
That's a strong critique. Are there other perspectives in the sources explaining this backlash?
Yes, definitely. Another study mentioned suggests something quite different, focusing on individual reactions. It indicated that even incidental allusions to diversity during interviews promoted defensive reactions in white male applicants, which reportedly led to things like deteriorated performance in the interview and even increased physiological arousal, like stress.
Wow. So it points to complex psychological dynamics just being triggered by the mention of diversity.
That's what that particular study suggests, yeah.
Hmm.
It highlights how tricky these conversations can be.
And the political and legal landscape, certainly here in the U.S., seems to be reflecting this growing contention. It's been all over the headlines.
Oh, absolutely. It's been very visible. Since 2023, we've seen Republican-dominated state legislatures considering, and sometimes passing, bills against DEI efforts,
Mm.
particularly targeting state colleges and universities.
Right.
Then, of course, the big Supreme Court decision in June 2023, eliminating the use of affirmative action in college admissions. And that had ripple effects. U.S. military academies followed suit, ending their race-conscious admissions policies in April 2025.
And Congress got involved too.
Yes. The House of Representatives voted, largely along party lines, back in July 2023, to ban all DEI offices and initiatives within the Pentagon and the military.
And it seems like this pushback extended beyond government into the private sector as well.
It definitely did. We
Okay.
saw reports of major companies, Google, McDonald's, Meta, rolling back some of their DEI efforts in early 2025. Even PBS reportedly shuttered its DEI office around that time.
Hmm.
And the shift was very clear at the federal level, too. Upon taking office in January 2025, the Trump administration signed an executive order specifically ending DEI programs within the federal government. That led to staff being put on leave, eventually laid off. They also ended affirmative action in federal contracting.
And removed website content.
Right, removing DEI-related content from government websites, which actually sparked a lawsuit from the city of Baltimore. And perhaps most recently, there were reports of the U.S. pressing French companies to comply with American anti-diversity policies, which France apparently pushed back on, accusing the U.S. of meddling and calling it a diktat.
Wow, that's quite a sweep of actions. It really feels like the acronym DEI itself has become, as one source put it, a scapegoat for broader societal issues. Or even used as a pejorative term like DEI hire to discredit people.
Yeah, the term itself became very loaded, very politicized.
So it makes sense then that companies are responding by evolving language, maybe choosing different words like culture, belonging, engagement, inclusion, trying to reset the narrative, perhaps.
It seems like a clear attempt to navigate this really charged environment,
Yeah.
to keep the core goals without using the politicized acronym. And what's interesting here, another report we looked at,
Hmm.
it pushed back on a common argument. The idea that setting corporate representation goals automatically leads to illegal reverse discrimination.
Okay.
This report argued that claim is often unfounded. It pointed out that these goals are typically quite modest, often aren't even met, and compared them to sales goals, saying, setting sales target doesn't automatically imply you're committing fraud to reach it.
That's a useful analogy. It adds some important context to the debate. So, okay, we have this intense debate. Significant political action, corporate changes. What do Americans actually think about DEI amidst all this? Is public opinion as polarized as the headlines might make it seem?
Well, it's nuanced, as public opinion often is.
Yeah.
Recent polls give us a few different angles. For example, a Washington Post-Ipsos poll from June 2024 found that 6 in 10 Americans actually believe DEI programs are a good thing.
6 in 10. So, a majority approval despite the backlash.
According to that poll, yes. But then look at a September 2024 poll from the Human Rights Campaign. It focused on LGBTQ Americans and found that 80% said they would boycott a company that repealed its DEI program.
80%. That's huge.
And 19%, almost 1 in 5, said they would actually quit their job if their workplace rolled back DEI.
Wow. So for some groups, it's not just abstract approval, it's a deeply held value, potentially impacting their employment and consumer choices.
Exactly. It shows a very strong commitment. And then a 2025 Axios poll adds yet another layer. It found that more than half of Americans across all demographics they surveyed said DEI initiatives had made no impact on their jobs.
No impact at all. Interesting.
Right, but here's the key part. Of those who did say it had an impact, a majority in almost all demographics said DEI had actually benefited their job rather than hindered it.
So let me get this straight. Despite the loud opposition and some corporate rollbacks, a majority seem to approve or at least feel it hasn't hurt them. And among those who have felt an impact, more see it as positive.
That's what those particular polls suggest, yeah. It indicates maybe a disconnect between some of the more vocal opposition and broader public sentiment or experience.
That is a crucial point. It really suggests the narrative might be more complex than the loudest voices imply. Okay, let's shift our lens beyond the U.S. for a moment. How are other regions approaching diversity and inclusion? Are they having similar debates, or is their experience quite different?
It's definitely varied, which, makes sense given different histories and cultures.
Hmm.
It's fascinating to compare. Take the UK, for instance. They have the 2010 Equality Act, which broadly prohibits discrimination based on a list of protected characteristics. And Lady Justice Hale, a very prominent figure there, made a really insightful comment about the judiciary. She noted the lack of diversity in the higher levels and said, quote, "It's always much easier to perceive the merit in people who are like you than in people who are a little bit different."
Hmm. That really gets to the heart of unconscious bias, doesn't it? Making it harder to see merit when it looks different from what you expect.
Absolutely. It's a fundamental challenge.
What about elsewhere in Europe?
Well, in Germany, one source highlighted a really vigorous ongoing debate about school inclusion. The aim is to integrate children with disabilities into community educational services, mainstream schools, essentially.
Okay.
But while that's the policy goal, the reality is that only about 28% of students with disabilities are currently in those kinds of inclusive schools. It shows the gap between policy and practice.
Right, the implementation challenge. And what about the Asia-Pacific region? That's incredibly diverse itself.
It is. And an NDA survey of journalists across the Asia-Pacific region found a really strong endorsement for diversity, equity, and inclusion as core journalism values.
Interesting focus on journalism there.
Yeah, and in that region, diversity was seen very broadly. It embraced issues way beyond just gender or ethnicity, included things like age, language, disability, mental health, even political views.
Oh, a very wide definition.
Very wide. However, the survey also revealed that Asian newsrooms are certainly not immune to discrimination. A shocking 56% of female journalists reported receiving sexist remarks.
Over half.
Yes. And 41% experienced unwanted physical contact, specifically from sources they were interacting with for their work.
That's incredibly sobering. It shows that even where the values are endorsed, the reality on the ground can be very different.
Exactly. It highlights that the values are there, but the practice, the lived experience, still has a long, long way to go.
Are there any regions or countries highlighted as maybe getting it right, or at least showing significant progress in certain areas?
Sweden often comes up in these discussions, particularly highlighted as a leader in integrating diverse groups into the labor market. The sources pointed to really high employment rates for women, 82.5%, for mothers, 79.6%, and for older workers, those aged 55-64, at 73%.
Those are impressive numbers.
They really are, suggesting their policies are having a tangible, positive impact on participation across different groups. And, if we try and connect all these global examples back to the individual experience, our sense of identity when we're at work, it's complex, isn't it? One source noted it rests not only on what we bring to the organization, but also on how we respond to the expectations that the organization has on us.
Okay, expectations. Like what?
Well, they could be explicit, like official dress codes, or they could be implicit, like unwritten rules about how people behave towards men versus women, for example.
Right, the unspoken culture.
Exactly. And individuals, consciously or not, might adapt their behavior to fit in, or they might choose to resist those expectations, which makes it absolutely crucial, the source argues, for managers to develop greater awareness of how these dynamics of identity formation are created, maintained, challenged, and experienced at work.
So managers need to be much more tuned in to how workplace culture shapes people's sense of self and belonging.
Precisely. It's not just about policies, it's about those daily interactions and expectations.
Okay, so bringing this all together, what does it mean for us, for you listening? It feels clear that the media plays just a critical role in how we understand all these complex issues, right? Whether it's cultural hegemony or the nuances of DEI.
It truly does. Mass media, especially the news media, holds this unequivocal position, as one source put it, a key role in establishing and spreading those common cultural references, which in turn influences our attitudes, our knowledge about the world. But they don't always do it in the most helpful or maybe expected ways.
How so? Like they can sometimes oversimplify things or miss crucial context.
Exactly that. A European Union report we saw noted that media coverage can often tend to associate ethnic minorities mainly with conflict, and frequently omits the positive aspects, things like their cultural contributions to the society they live in.
So focusing on problems rather than the whole picture.
Right. And they might also simplify complex realities through what the report called fragmentation, basically reporting incidents without explaining the deeper underlying causes of social problems. That can lead to a very narrow, maybe even distorted understanding.
That's a powerful reminder for all of us as media consumers to think critically about the narratives presented. But on a more positive note, the internet was mentioned too, wasn't it, as potentially offering a counterbalance.
Yes, absolutely. One source highlighted how the internet has boosted the visibility of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, those groups that are actively struggling to promote values like cultural diversity and to call out discriminatory messages wherever they see them.
So it provides a platform for alternative voices, counter-narratives.
Exactly. It helps foster more diverse perspectives in the overall public discourse, which is crucial.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, wow, it's clear that the forces shaping global discourse, the evolution of DEI, they're incredibly multifaceted, deeply interconnected. We've touched on how cultural norms, often, yes, influenced by dominant Anglospheric perspectives, can subtly shape our viewpoints, even our political language. And at the same time, we see these DEI frameworks trying to address historical inequities, trying to foster more inclusive environments, but facing both, widespread support and really significant opposition and backlash. It's a dynamic space.
It really is. And it brings us back to maybe one of the most fundamental questions underlying all of this. In a world with just oceans of information where ideas cross borders and cultures constantly, how do we figure out, as one source asked,
Yeah.
which of a multitude of differences between people justify us in treating them differently and which similarities justify similar treatment?
Hmm.
It's a continuous, really complex navigation, isn't it?
Yeah.
There are no easy answers there.
No easy answers at all. And maybe that leads to a final thought for you, our listener, something to maybe sit with after this. Consider how readily perhaps you adopt certain frameworks or terms, maybe political labels, maybe social concepts that originate primarily from dominant cultural centers like the Anglosphere we discussed. What are the potential blind spots? What unintended consequences might arise when we apply these concepts locally, maybe without deeply examining their specific relevance or the historical context in our own communities? And maybe how might we encourage conversations that are truly diverse, truly locally resonant, rather than just sort of importing existing frameworks whole cloth, something to think about.